Welcome to part 3 of the G-Body AFX spindle swap. I really wanted to do a A-B comparison between the two up at Blackbird Motorsports Park, but now that I got the car taken apart here, I need to finish up some welding on the engine bay crossmember, but I'm able to push on the tire right here and see that the upper ball joints are bad anyway. I mean, not bad enough that I couldn't do a test, but also my new ball joints, the bolt pattern's a little different, so I'm going to have to modify the upper control arms, and I had originally been planning on rebuilding some different lowers, but given the upper control arm pattern being different and not just being a bolt-on thing and having to modify that anyway, it kind of eliminates being able to do an A-B test without building new lowers and new uppers, and being as I've just proven it at this point that the factory ball joints wear out. I mean, I think I got a season out of these uppers, and I broke the lowers about 3/4 of the way through last season, so that's why I'm excited to try to get to the newer, stronger stuff. So I think we'll just be modifying both of these control arms in the name of saving time and hundreds of dollars. This is the current setup on the car. As you can see, we got the same 12/8 Corvette rotor, although the new one's got slots in it. Also the same super light style caliper. This one's just got a little bit smaller piston on part of it. Factory modified hubs. All the same stuff we've been looking at, and this is the Speedway 3-piece spindle. So the dimensions are pretty close on this. We're also running the pinto arm and the brake bracket. So there's a little bit of difference in the spacing on these. I believe the AFX one's a little shorter, or was it a little taller? I don't remember now. But it also depends on which style caliper, because there's two different mounting styles. See, this one's got that little 1/8 inch notch in there, and the other ones that I set up are flat, so that changes the spacing too. Currently running a +1 inch upper and a +1 inch lower ball joint, which is not helping the situation as far as how I'm beating up these ball joints. That's another benefit of going to this tall spindle, is I'll be able to go to standard lengths, upper and lower. So here is a good comparison of what the changes are. You can tell that these aren't quite lined up because the actual reference point for them is going to be this bolt hole and this bolt hole are the same relative to the spindle center line. However, because of the +1 inch lower ball joint I've been running, it actually puts it in between these two because this is a 2 inch drop. So what we have here is basically by the time you put the +1 inch ball joint on and the standard ball joint, they're going to have the pivot points in the same place. And likewise at the top, we have, you know, a +1 inch ball joint here and a regular ball joint, and the total length from pivot point to pivot points changing by less than 1/4 of an inch. But what we're gaining is where we are relative to that pivot point, because that pivot point determines where our lower control arm sits. As you can see with the AFX spindle, the spindle center line itself is moving upward on the overall spindle, which means our wheel center line versus our lower pivot is a bigger distance, which means the car is getting lowered if the lower control arm doesn't change position. Or we can turn up our coilovers and we can raise the car back up to match, but then we have the same ride height, but we have our lower control arm at a different angle, which changes our instant centers and roll center. It's the same steering arm on both. So we won't be changing anything there. The brake bracket and rotors and calipers, all that stuff will stay the same. I still got some life left in the ones that are on the car, so these brand new stuff I'll save. They'll definitely be needed later in the season. As I said before, the big reason we're changing to this taller spindle, in addition to being able to change our roll center, is going to shorter ball joints. So that shorter lower ball joint is also bigger in diameter, making it stronger, and same with the upper. So there's the difference in the bolt pattern for our upper ball joint. Going to this truck style, the holes don't line up. The center bore is about the same, but this looks like it's hitting on the radius, so it's held up a little bit, so I'll have to radius the hole out on the inside on this edge. But plan is I'll just clean all the powder coat off of here. I'm just going to weld these 4 holes solid, and then I can set it in there and then transfer punch with the ball joint. As you can see, the length difference, this being the G-body metric chassis with a +1 inch length versus the stock length truck ball joint. We will end up with this being slightly longer than the standard of the metric, but that's okay. That's where we get our little bit of height difference in the spindles. Alright, well, I just set up and not even that aggressive of a whack, and this ball joint fell out, which is a big reason why I'm wanting to change out the style. So this is going to be the new ball joint for the lower. As you can see, it's not a whole lot shorter. In fact, it's probably almost the same length, but this is a standard size instead of being a +1 inch, and should come up on camera there that it's actually a pretty significant difference in size there. You can see that the new ball joint on the left is quite a bit thicker. I think it's like 110 thousandths thicker, so almost an 1/8 inch at its thickest. And it's threaded on the bottom. So rather than it being the smooth bore where during the course of a year, especially doing autocross stuff, it shifts that ball joint back and forth, and this bore is just getting worn out and the ball joints pop out. So you either have to weld them in with a few tacks in a couple of places, or you gotta kind of be aware that it's gonna happen, and I'm just annoyed with that. So now we've got these threaded sleeves to put in so that the ball joints will be threaded in, they won't be falling out anymore, and I'll have to cut the old sleeve away. Basically I just gotta match up this arc and get it centered on there, and I can just cut that off and then weld this one in. Here's a better view of where the pivot points are about lined up as far as the camera view there. But then the taper starts here, and you can see the little marks from where it seats in the spindle versus how much higher up those are. So really it's right about here is the bottom of the spindle on the +1 metric chassis versus here for the Chrysler style lower ball joint. I'm going to refer to spindle height a few times in this video, and what I'm most likely going to be referring to is the total height pivot to pivot. So that's including the height of the ball joints. As I mentioned earlier when comparing the spindles, that the overall height really isn't going to change a whole lot. It's within 1/4 inch. I got notes around here somewhere about whether it's plus or minus. But I'm referring to that from center of pivot to center of pivot. That's why we're able to have a spindle that the AFX is 1 3/4 inches taller itself than the metric spindle, but the ball joints are shorter, which takes up that difference to get them very, very close. And it's fine because I'm really at a place where I feel like I've got a really good camber curve going on in the car. Like last year was the best tire life I've ever had. And I don't want to go too crazy different than that because I don't want to have to like start over and being far enough off that I have to go through more tires during the year. So keeping that as a known, the goal is to try to change the roll center and see what that does. So that's where I'm focusing with this. That's why the important part is that AFX is a 2-inch drop. Because if I just put it on the car, the pivot to pivot is going to be about the same. Because of the plus 1 inch lower, we're getting an extra inch of drop out of the metric spindle. So technically that ends up being a 1-inch drop versus our 2-inch drop on the AFX. So we're going to have an extra inch of drop. If I just bolted everything on the car, it's going to drop the front of the car about 1 inch. But because I don't necessarily want to use that 1 inch of drop, it would be nice, but it's not going to change my roll center in the front. But if I keep the ride height the same, that means I'm raising the front of the car back up compared to just bolting stuff on, which is then going to put a steeper angle in that lower control arm, raising the roll center. All right, to help visualize what the changes are going to be here, our pivot point for the lower control arm is right about behind here somewhere. And then we've got our pivot point for our ball joint over here. The line between those two, which at ride height is pretty much dead flat on the current setup, which means that when we factor in our upper control arm, it makes an instant center that is completely level with the lower pivot point, because that's level. So when the two intersect, which is, you know, often space on the car off the passenger side for the driver's side, you draw a line from that intersection point back to the ground contact patch of the driver's front tire, and where that point ends up at the center of the car is your roll center, which basically just means that because our lower control arm is dead flat in this current setup, it forces it to be dead center with that between the pivot points. And with our center of gravity being up, estimates being around the camshaft height of the engine, that lever, that distance becomes the lever that makes the car roll. So my goal here is to take away roll of the car by making that lever shorter. So when I switch spindles here, I should be able to keep the same ride height but put more angle in this lower control arm, which is going to then raise the instant center. And then when that line gets drawn back to the contact patch of the tire, the point where it's in the center of the car will be higher, making that lever shorter. And with that lever being shorter, then the car will naturally want to roll less. The theory being, like, if the center of gravity and that roll center were in the exact same point, that the car would naturally not roll at all. And if I can get the car to naturally want to roll less, that means that I can set the car suspension up softer, whether that's a smaller torsion bar, sway bar in the front, or if it's a softer spring at the wheel. Both of which are going to make the car move its contact grip patch between the tires, or, you know, the balance of that more evenly, versus right now I've been getting too much roll in the front of the car where it's lifting the inside front on braking if I start to turn too aggressively, especially during autocross situations, and it's locking up that inside front. So if I can get this to work where I have less natural roll at the front of the car and I can run a softer sway bar, it'll keep that inside tire down on the ground with more grip for longer. All right, got the upper welded up and re-drilled and the lower swapped to the threaded. color was just some stuff, the only blue I had laying around, so I figured what the heck, might as well use it up. It's just there to keep it from rusting anyway. Nobody's gonna see it. So, we just gotta wait for this to dry and then see how much out around happened with that lower housing. Just from welding on one side of it, it's gonna have shrunk it and made it weird, but as long as we can still get the ball joint in there, shouldn't be a problem. I mean, these things are designed for that, and it's pretty thick, so I know for sure that the pressed in ones were definitely not round after welding, but they still pressed in fine. So the upper just bolts on, so that'll be super easy. I was able to just run a chamfering tool around the top, and it was chamfered enough to get it sitting there flat. I think, I don't know, I can't remember if it's this side or the other side. Oh yeah, this side's bent a little bit anyway, but it wasn't enough to throw any alignment out, so, and I'm sure that's just bent from when I've broken the ball joint on this side once, and I've broken the other side once, so maybe they're both bent now, but it's not enough to throw the alignment out, so we'll just wait for this to dry and get everything put together. Alright, so we got the AFX spindle on the driver's side of the car and the metric spindle on the passenger side. I didn't do any adjustments at first, so I took a bunch of measurements so I could have both, you know, basically the AFX, because of the 2-inch drop, ended up lowering the car around 3/4 of an inch total between the ball joint changes and all that. And I just wanted to see what the measurements were for the suspension geometry with it there. And then I raised it back up to the same ride height on both sides and measured it again. As I said, the goal is to shorten the roll center leverage, so I want to raise the roll center to make the lever arm between center of gravity and the roll center smaller so that the car naturally wants to roll less. Interestingly, having the car just be lower when I just put the spindle on actually ended up with that arm being shorter than after I raised it back up to regular ride height. So what that tells me is that getting your center of gravity lower or closer to the ground is of a bigger advantage than what your suspension geometry is actually doing. At least on this car in particular. I've discovered that the real setback for these cars is the lower control arm mounting points on the frame are the only thing I haven't modified yet as far as stock suspension geometry. And once you try to lower the car, because I mean this car is probably 4 to 5 inches lower than stock, and it just ends up with that between the ball joint pivot and the pivot on the frame being so low that even with changing the ride height 3/4 of an inch, you're not putting much of an angle change into that. And that's really controlling where you can actually move the roll center to, because it's just not changing height off the ground. Even if it goes out to infinity, which you could easily make it that be the roll center by flattening out the upper arm or even angling it slightly upward, as long as they converge at some point. But the problem is that ends up with such a long arm that you then have to draw a line from that point back to the center of the contact patch, and where it's at the center of the car is where your roll center is at, and it's not changing a whole lot in height. I mean, to just as an example here, I went from the metric spindle having an arm length from center of gravity to the roll center of 16 and 5/16 inches. Like, it's huge because it's so low down the car. I mean, way down here. I mean, it's only 7.5 inches off the ground with the metric. Switching to the AFX spindle, I only was able to raise that up to 7 5/8, but the car was 3/4 of an inch lower, so I actually got 3/4 of an inch closer together, and that was the biggest change, and that brought me down to 15 and 9/16 for the length of the lever arm. But then when I raised the ride height back up, I only ended up with a lever arm of 15 3/4, so actually a little bit longer than it was lowered. And that's because the center of gravity went back up and my roll center only came up to 6 1/4. So it was a smaller change. And really, I don't know how much lower I can run the car just because I'm going to run out of clearance to the fenders and everything. And I'm already been struggling with how low the car is because once I get the splitter on here, like your approach angle is so bad, it sucks. And that's because there's, you know, by the time I put the splitter on here, there's 3 feet of car out in front of this from the center point of the wheel. So what I'm leaning towards now is I can combine these two where I do have the roll center raised up and a smaller lever, which is what the goal of this was. But I think I have enough room that I can go to my mounting points. And I think I can raise the mounting points by at least 3/4 of an inch. And if I did that, I'll be raising the roll center even more without moving the center of gravity, and I should be able to easily take that full 3/4 of an inch, roughly, leverage shorter, and I could get down to 15. You know, or even under 15 if I ran the car in the lowered state and with that roll center raised up also. However, the more I lower the front of the car now, the more it's flattening that arm back out, and that's why there really wasn't a big change in the instant center and the roll center height when I had the car lower down. Alright, I realized I can make use of the regular Chrysler style ball joint boot. Gotta notch it though, so I've got these notches here, and they're just to clear the bolts. So once I get this in there, it's still kind of hard to put on. But I just got a big socket. Actually, it's a what, four-wheel drive front socket for something, but it's the right size. I can just and now it's sitting on there. It's positively retained. The back in the hole, it's gonna squish it a little different, but at least it'll be nice and sealed up. We can't do the same with the bottom, but I've been living with that problem for several years now. The bottom joint boot isn't a very tight fit. Like, I mean, it's kind of close, but it's a little bit big. I tried putting a zip tie around it, and that didn't quite work. It just kind of popped off. But I mean, really, the biggest thing there is it'll act as a shield enough to keep rocks and other larger debris bits out. I mean, it's still going to get some dust in there, but as long as you keep the ball joint full of grease, it shouldn't be letting anything in there anyway. For the top here, I'm using double washers to make sure the castle nut engagement with the hole is correct, because otherwise it gets where the hole is above the castle nut, just how it fits in here. And when I did ream these spindles, I did as little as possible, or at least where I thought it needed to go. I made sure that I had full taper engagement. That was the key thing. Alright, this may be super terrible, but I wanted to draw out the geometry on the tabletop to just get a better visualization of it. Probably should have flipped these over so they weren't oil stained. It'd be easier, but anyway, this is a 2-scale representation of the car as best as I could really take the measurements. Just the way the car sits on the ground, and then being able to try to find the exact pivot points isn't that easy. But this side of the table represents the center line of the tire. These would be the ball joint locations, silver being for the metric, black for the AFX. Our contact patch is going to be the very corner over here, because the bottom is going to be ground level, and at the very top edge, it just happens to be that this is sized at 22 inches, which is roughly where center of gravity is, or at least what we're estimating it at. So all of these lines represent the different geometries of moving each around. So here out the wheel, you can see where the ball joints moved from the spindle difference. They're within 1/4 of an inch in total height, but as you can see, the upper is a little bit closer because we got a little bit taller with the AFX than the metric. But our pivot points stayed pretty much the same. I have, I don't know, an 1/8 inch difference in length here, which again is just what I had written down. Obviously these are the chassis points. They wouldn't move, other than the lower two with the AFX are for when I just bolted it on, didn't adjust the ride height, and then the uppers should be where the ride height is. So they match up, or at least my upper measurement matched, but my lower was off a little bit. But this is just to visualize it and kind of see what's happening and what's moving. This line here is our center of the car. So that is where our roll center is going to be compared to, because if the car's symmetrical side to side, if, I know it's not perfect, but we're just trying to prove a theory here. Where the instant centers are out here, you draw a line from there back to our contact patch, and where they cross the center of the car is going to be where our roll center is. And you can see how they moved around over here. The lowest one being our metric spindle, and then oddly enough we went up slightly but out quite a bit, and that lands us on the exact same line going back to our contact patch. So the roll center actually didn't really change between the metric spindle and the AFX just bolting it on. Didn't change anything. Just because of that, so it was such a small difference, and our lower control arm angle here, which is between these points and these points, is just so flat we're not getting much of a change. However, when the car was raised back up to ride height, now we moved up here. We gained quite a bit of height, but we also went out farther. Well, same thing, that line's got to get drawn back down to the contact patch, and even though it's close to 2 inches taller here, it's actually like 1.75 inches, we only have an inch change in the roll center height, which is still quite a bit when we're talking all the way from the very top of the board here. I mean, it's almost 16 inches. Yeah, 16.5 inches is what I've been running at, and it's getting it up to about 15.5. So I mean, that is still a big change, but ideally we'd want to be up here somewhere. And drawing this out has really helped me visualize that, you know, lowering the car, and that's what's not being factored in here, is even though that this roll center height did not change with putting the AFX spindle on, with it at the lower ride height though, that brought the center of gravity down. So we would have gotten that 3/4 inches closer together just because of the ride height drop, even though the actual suspension geometry didn't change. However, with, you know, back up at full ride height, then we're looking at a 1 inch change. So that's actually a little bit better being up at the higher ride height as far as making that arm shorter, which is opposite of what my math was coming out, because my math was saying lowering the car was going to be a little bit better. But again, this is just, there's going to be only so much error that I can factor for and try to compensate. But the big thing is our flat angle of our lower control arm is really what's screwing our being able to change by a large margin. Because, you know, we're sitting right about there, the top edge being where the control arm geometry is. Even if we continue off into infinity, out the opposite side of the car, it really doesn't matter, because we can move this upper angle and we can tip the upper flat, but now we're going to be screwing up our camber gain. It's just going to keep moving that point out way farther, and we still have to come back to center of the car. So even if we went up, say, 20 inches at 20 feet outside the car, by the time you got to draw it back down to here, it's probably not changing a whole lot, which is why we don't have a very big change. But if I was able to raise the pivot point on the lower control arm, now you can see how much quicker we're gaining height, and we're actually going to be coming in closer with our upper control arm. I mean, almost to the point where, you know, in theory, if we raised it up at such an angle like that, we could hit our instant center right on roll center, and look how much difference we'd end up with there. The problem is on the chassis in the car, I mean, that's adding an inch, 2 inches at the pivot point, and I really don't have room for that. I think I can get 3/4 of an inch, which I just got to decide if I want to jump into that much work on it or not. Another option would be we could lower this ball joint some more, and that would give us more angle also. And I'm already at a plus ½ inch ball joint with the AFX, so I can only gain like another ½ inch down here. So if I was to do that, you know, I'm gonna, and up at the higher ride height, and I don't know, about a ½ inch, we would end up, let's see here, yeah, higher ride height. that would get us to about there, which, interestingly enough, looks like be almost 3/4 of an inch additional, which would be really nice. You know, so now it's just, it might have to be a combination of several different factors. So if I was to go, let's see, well, down a 1/2 inch there, and let's say I can get 3/4 out of it at the pivot point. Combining those two, now look how much progress we're making. You know, and that clearly, I mean, these two would be if I added the 1/2 inch longer ball joint, but by moving up that 3/4 of an inch, look how much of a bigger gain that is, because we're putting more angle into that lower control arm. You know, so ideally, I mean, shoot, if we wanted to end up way up here, kind of a thing, like crying out loud, I'd have to be adding 2 or 3 inches to that lower control arm, and I don't have the space for that. It's